We just talked about the situation in Brazil, and we talked and compared it to what's going on over here. Don made an interesting point that it's not so much about the candidate and Donald Trump, it's the people voting for him who are so frustrated with what's going on that they're not even allowed them to put forth their voice. We question all the time, what are we going to do? Do we need a revolution over here? How can we have a revolution if we're fighting each other all the time, if we're at each other's throats? Don said it very clearly, and until people realize their class, that they are working class, and they are distracted by their religion, their race, the color of their eyes, we'll never get along. We're constantly fighting each other. And I think even what you see going on in Brazil is dividing the people over there, the same way the tactics were used over here, and we are so divisive in the United States. However, there was talk of a revolution years ago. Some people say it was organic. Some people say it was a revolution bought off by the elites. Somebody who's an expert on this whole situation is Don Debar, and I want to talk about it because when I hear people say that the Bolshevik Revolution was tainted and it was funded by the elites, I think, well, that's kind of whack, because it seemed to me every time I've talked about the Bolshevik Revolution, people have expressed to me what happened there. I'm not an expert on it, but when we had a conversation the other day about it, Don, I knew about 80% about what you were talking about. It's those little small points that really tie it together. So why don't you start off, talk a little bit of a history in a condensed form about what was going on in Russia before the Bolshevik Revolution, and that led us to that revolution.
How much time do we have?
I said in a condensed form, Paisan.
Okay, I could condense it, like, very condensed. Russia is the Russian Federation is a current nation state that occupies territory that consists of parts of the old Russian Empire that preceded the Soviet Union, that was assembled over a period of maybe 1,000 years. They're coming into the 19th and early 20th century, was an interesting reflection of and contradiction to and extension of the history of both Europe and Asia. The country, for example, in the 1800s, went as far as North America, including what's now Alaska. That's what was sold to the U.S. William Seward brokered, that made Alaska ultimately part of the United States as it is now. And it goes all the way to the Polish border and the border of Finland in Europe. At a time up until the early part of the 20th century, Finland was part of Russia, of the Russian Empire. It was ruled by a royal family that was related to some of the other royal families of Europe.
Yes.
And there were, long-standing relationships and contradictions inside that family, and among other configurations of power around Europe. This was true also during the period of the 15th, 16th, and 17th centuries, of the global growth of European imperialism, or the growth of European global imperialism. Columbus, Magellan, yada, 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 yada. Russia never really went marauding around the world to acquire other colonies. It had everything it needed already. And so its history was divergent there. It also did not experience the Industrial Revolution in the same fashion that Britain, France, and other parts of Europe did, and the United States ultimately, and other parts of the Americas and Asia. So when you came into the 20th century, it had some things that were parallel. You had, an agricultural arrangement that was feudal in form and essence up until 1861 or 1862, I don't remember, with something that you could call the Emancipation Proclamation of the serfs in Russia. There was a feudal relationship that was not much different from the condition of chattel slavery, people subject to chattel slavery in the United States and elsewhere in the Western Hemisphere. People we bought and sold. Many were attached to the land. There were multiple classes. Some belonged to the czar or the royal family. Others belonged, traded like cattle or whatever. There was also an explosion of the manufacturing that it existed more or less in the same form as they had grown up in Western Europe and Great Britain, and some industrial, some considerable industrial development as you came into the 20th century. And with that began the development of an industrial proletariat and a sort of a separation of town and country, and a concentration of population in cities that started to resemble the same forms and the same processes that had taken place in Europe and the Americas a century or two or three earlier. And what was the product of this was the same thing that was produced in Europe and the Americas a century or two earlier, including particularly the French Revolution in 1789 at Sec, and also the American Revolution, as we call it here, and some others. Over the course of the 19th century, a number of important developments like this took place. And you also saw, as the societies developed, for example, in France, after the first of the revolutions of 1789, that ended up with Napoleon in power at the end of it, you had an intensification of the development of some of the classes that were represented in the society that had been struggling sort of on the ground, resulting in a struggle at the government political level, resulting in a revolution, resulting in new governments, resulting in new configurations of power among those people in the government. This happened several times in France as the working class grew, as the owning class also grew with its, imperial, outlets and the sources of revenue and power. And so in the same way that you saw the French Revolution in the late 18th century and then the mid 19th century, and then the Paris Commune in the 1870s, Russia kind of went through those stages in a very rapid succession, with the first revolution in 1905, resulting in something pretty much like the Magna Carta, 800 years earlier or whatever, in Great Britain, where the imperial power of the royal family was curtailed by other powerful interests in the country. Many of those represented by the owners of industrial and agricultural concerns.
Who was the previous before those agriculture and those industrial owners? You told me, like, I think you used the term, just guys who wore funny hats were kind of like the power, right? The power mechanism. And now you have this whole, the people who make things, the factory owners. Yeah.
You had feudal relationships in essence until, and outright, again, like outright serfdom and those kinds of feudal relationships up until 1861 or two. But more or less, feudal relations in terms of power, in terms of allocation of land, in terms of allocation of resources, in terms of those things also, as in terms of how much can I eat and my kids eat and such. That happened. That was all the way through 1905.
Yes,
when the people that owned the factories and what the other actual businesses that had sprung up over the past 100 years started to say, look, the czar can't tell everybody to do what to do all the time. We want a voice in this thing that we have a big stake in. And so the people were in a desperate state. There was an industrial proletariat that had, like I said, you had town and country now. People in the town and people in the country really didn't have an accommodation. Peasants were starting to have a hard time, which is what the serfs became. unlanded peasants in particular, or some small landowning peasants.
Yeah.
The industrial workers had a hard time. They were absolutely at the beck and call of the factory owners and also of the government, which was very oppressive in terms of.
I do want to point out, Don, and correct me if I'm wrong. I think it's just important to point out right now, because you said this before. The Tsar, who was the monarch in Russia, was related to those monarchs in Europe.
Yeah.
A lot of people don't realize that. That they think it was just this old Russia. No, they were all related. So very important to point out. But please, you had the revolution in 1905, I believe.
So they have a revolution in 1905. And what happens? You have
who led that revolution, though? Very important. Who led that?
People first. You have industrial workers who rise up, and peasants who rise up. They have no understanding. They're not ready to make a revolution. They're ready to raise hell.
Yeah.
And then there are various other groups in the society who we're ready for change here. The bourgeoisie, the landed peasantry, parts of the aristocracy that were sort of maybe oppositional, they were all represented in different groupings in 1905. And so you have a situation where they say a revolutionary condition exists when the people will not be governed the people who are governed will not be governed in the old ways, and the people who govern cannot govern in the old ways. And so something has to give, basically. And so what gave here was after you had an upsurge of revolutionary activity and a huge, monstrous clampdown, an accommodation made among the rich folks, the czar, the owners of the industrial bourgeoisie, basically, and the landed aristocracy that were not part of the royal family and such, where they created a Duma, like a parliament, and a system like that, and a rule of law with courts. Up until 1905, they could come take you to the czar, and he could run a sword through you, or take your wife and take her on vacation or whatever.
Yeah.
And there's no place to go. That was the power. That was the political structure there.
Yeah.
But
that changed in 1905, right?
So they try to go to a to sort of some modified British system, and that is what is in power up to and including the entry into the First World War in 1914. And the working class gets a little bit of, everybody gets a little bit of an improvement in their situation, with some notable exceptions. And so there's struggle, but the society has some cohesion and functions. And then you end up in this war.
World War
Russia
I.
is in a coalition called the Triple Entente.
Yes.
It has France, the United Kingdom, Italy, Japan, and towards the end, the United States. On the other side, they're at war with, and this is how it ends up, with Germany, Austria-Hungary, the Ottoman Empire, and Bulgaria. And after there's a revolution in Russia in the beginning of 1917. Russia starts to fall apart. Russia is losing the war, whether the alliance is winning or not. And Russia is facing Germany on one side, and they're also facing Bulgaria and the Ottoman Empire. And on the other side of that collection of countries is Britain, France, Italy, the United States, and then over there is Japan.
Yeah.
So you start having famine in Russia. You start having soldiers' revolts in the army. You start having a collapse in industrial production. And you end up with a revolution. And The first revolution comes in what by the Russian calendar is February of 1917. And it's pretty much the whole of society that's in revolution against the existing government. The modified czarist government. Okay.
Yes.
They establish a provisional government with representation from each of the various sectors of the society, including the workers. And so the what's now known as the Bolshevik Party. Let me back out for a second before we get to that. During the 1905 revolution, there was a party called the Russian Social Democratic Party.
Yes.
And it was the sort of the precursor to the Russian Communist Party and some others.
Okay.
And there was the question of what to do. It was sketched out in 1903, really, before this happened, in a pamphlet that Lenin wrote called What is to be Done, to make it easy. Looking at the existing configuration of forces in the country, the situation in facing the working class and peasants in particular, and what form of outcome do we want to see from this, revolutionary maelstrom that's swirling right now as we figure out what's the government going to look like next week.
Yeah.
So there were some people that wanted the working class to not be part of the compromise with the bourgeoisie, which in other words, the industrial and financial interests, or with the landed peasantry, or with the czar. And inside this is inside the RSDP, the Russian Social Democratic Party. Lenin's faction was in favor of the workers pull out. We are, going to try to push this all the way through to a workers' revolution, certainly to at least the first phase of a revolution that will end up putting power in the workers' hands.
Yes.
The vote on that inside the RSDP or whatever decision making, I can't remember how the hell they did it at this point, favors Lenin's position. That's why they're called Bolsheviks. They're a majority. The minority position, which included Trotsky, by the way, was in favor of accommodation.
Yes. And
they didn't prevail, although I don't remember if they participated or not, but in any event, everybody became irrelevant because what happened was the bourgeoisie and the czar and his family,
monarchs,
the monarchy, and some of the the big agricultural interests, they decided what to do. They set up the Duma, and that's what operated until you get to basically 1917. So that government leads them into a catastrophe. The country is in ruins. The army is in retreat. The peasants are sitting on top of food that the people in the cities need to eat. There's no way to get it to them. They have nothing to trade for it anyway. And in the midst of this revolutionary upsurge, soldiers come back. There's revolts and mutinies and all kinds of stuff with that. And you end up with a provisional government in February of 1917, headed by Kerensky, and that has representation.
Was the Tsar completely gone by then?
I'm sorry?
Was the Tsar removed by then?
Well, the Tsar isn't really... The Tsar was gone by the end of the year, as in no one even knows where his ashes are.
Yeah.
Okay, they decided we're not going to have like a grave for monarchists to rally around or any of that crap. They didn't just liquidate him or gasify him. He was like, but so you now have a provisional government that's running the country, and they're trying to decide what to do. So the Bolsheviks, looking at the landscape, see that the needs of the people, they're trying to figure out, how do we assemble the people of this country who are in a like condition, into a political force. I don't know, maybe a military force would be a term to use, but that can take power and hold it and operate it.
Yeah, yeah.
And so, they raise a bunch of demands, and they raise the demand to the provisional government that the construction of this government should be a product of popular constituent assemblies, which is basically a constituent assembly is an assembly of people who are charged with, say, writing a constitution or, something that's going to help constitute the state. A popular assembly is an assembly of the people. I just walk in. When we saw Occupy Wall Street at the beginning of that spreading, what you had in essence were popular assemblies. These were places where people assembled. There you go, popular assembly. They sat down and started hashing out the parameters to have conversations about the things they wanted to talk about. And then they started to talk about them and figured out ways to formulate conversations and to encourage mass participation in the conversation, aimed at charting out some steps that everyone could agree on to move forward, to make a list of goals that people wanted to realize, to construct a mechanism or mechanisms to help achieve those goals. It's like sitting down with a group of people to try to set up a business. First, have we decided what the business is going to be? And then how do we do it?
Yeah.
And only this is obviously a much more complex task. And now what we're doing is we're talking to factory workers in Russia in 1917, many of whom can't read. Most of them haven't read Tolstoy or Lenin. Okay. And of course, agricultural people who, 50 years ago were slaves and who were still waiting for the Virgin Mary to land or whatever superstition prevailed at the time. So looking across that landscape, the task was how do you organize this into a political force? And so looking at the needs of the people, it wasn't subtle, and you didn't really need to have a popular assembly to find out what are the three most important things. They were the following. First, bread for the people in the cities. They needed to eat. In the countryside, land, because the people who worked the land didn't own it.
Yeah.
So they didn't have a stake in any of this thing that was going on. They worked their asses off and they lived a subsistence life. And even that wasn't working now. And the last thing was this overarching problem they all had with stuff blowing up and people getting shot and body bags being sent back from the German front and all of that. They needed peace.
Yeah.
And so the Bolsheviks constructed a program of bread, land, and peace. And it's like walking down the street with the sign, people fell in behind them. And in November, they had another revolution.
Now, wait a second. I want to stop because I want to make sure before we get to the November Revolution, because what I just want to understand is that the revolution in 1917 was a vacuum had come through. The Tsar was gone. He was removed. They couldn't even find his ashes. And they had this existing government. But it was somewhat tainted, right? It wasn't it really didn't fulfill the needs of the people. The Bolsheviks, who had been involved with a lot of, planning and organizing, getting together, and the Bolsheviks, pretty much the three main players in the Bolsheviks we know today were Lenin, Trotsky, and Stalin, correct? Those three. They were part of this mechanism that said, well, wait, this is not good enough. The vacuum in which came through and what it spit out is not suitable for what the actual people need. So in other words, if we had a revolution over here and it wasn't meeting the needs of the people across the board, and the needs of the people at the time in 1917 in Russia were food for the hungry, land for the workers, and peace, because they were so sick and tired of wars going on, that needed to be fulfilled. Am I right? Are we on the right page so far?
Yeah. I think so. I'm not understanding really where you're going with this, but
well, I just want to make sure people understand that, because see, there was two revolutions, right? There was one in the beginning of 1917. There was one towards the end. The one that
Yeah, Great October
was fulfilled in 1917, in the beginning of 1917. Because people often say that the Bolshevik Revolution was a revolution that was sponsored and paid for by the elites, right? And I think Arm & Hammer, you had mentioned, was involved in the first revolution of 1917.
No. He was after. No.
Okay.
Look, so I know what you're talking about in terms of like the popular mythology in the West. First of all, it's like a lot of other things. Revolutions are not the product of some genius or even of a vanguard class. People that imagine that Lenin made the revolution don't understand history, humanity, social organization, or Lenin for that matter, including reading him. Some of the players in the Bolshevik side, including a latecomer Trotsky, Lenin, you had Maxim Gorky, what's her name? Nadezhda Krupskaya. She was an advisor and wife to Lenin. What's his name? Zinoviev, Kamenev. There are a whole bunch of people that were leaders and organizers and foot soldiers and theoreticians and orators and whatever. The central point of Marxist analysis of history is that it is the development of society and the productive capacity and the actions of the masses of workers that are history. They're the engine of history, and in fact, they are history. And the product of the operation of these things is what places anyone at any given time in the location that you're looking at. I am here as a result of all of the work and all of the machinery and everything else that's been built and operated and done in the history before this moment. And so a revolution is exactly the same thing. A revolution is a product of Russia's history, of the external conditions that existed, of the failure of the existing power configurations to reflect the reality on the ground of who was doing the work and who needed what in order to continue the operation of the society. These are all of the things that are, the soil and the whole of a revolution. And so people tend to identify political ideology or to view it or treat it almost in the same way that they do religion or even like an affinity for a sports team or something. I guess it's a natural trait because people are not generally educated in the study of the operation of mass organizations and also the records up and whatever happens in the next 100 years is going to be real interesting on this point because of all the data that's been collected and is now being processed. We don't really know what happened in the countryside outside of Moscow, say on June 8th, 1916, that might have made some guy go to St. Petersburg, angry about something, to tip over an apple cart that made somebody else scream. They ended up in prison, came out a revolutionary, shot. There's 100 million people doing all these things.
Yeah.
And the revolution is a product of all of it. And so, the big man of history theory, that's not a Marxist theory. That's not a Marxist concept. People who call themselves Marxists hold themselves out as the big man of the moment, or that person that I bow down to was the big man of history and I'm his apostle. That kind of shit goes on with all human activity. But the actual nature of a revolution and the way it's viewed by people who are applying Marx's analysis of history You can call yourself a Marxist or whatever. If you're applying the tools that he developed and left for us to work with, we understand these things are much more complex. So, all right, for all of that, to explain that my shorthand that I'm going to give you is not a conveyance of the essence of what happened, but only a response to this question, because it's something that's talked about all the time.
Yeah.
You had Lenin, who was, in essence, one of the quarterbacks, or the quarterback of the Bolshevik faction of the Russian Social Democratic Party. Architect, in a way, if you have an architect that draws the picture that 9 million people build of the revolution, and the one of the theoretical planners of the Soviet state, post-revolution, kind of acted as a strategist and tactician for their group, moving from the February to the October Revolution in 1917, and then sort of helping to. They were at war when you had the revolution in the October Revolution, when the Bolsheviks ended up in power in 1917. The world declared war on Russia. The Brits came, the Americans came, the Germans came. Everybody that was fighting Russia and everybody that was an ally of Russia came to put this thing back to sleep.
Yeah.
Churchill said, we want to suffocate the Soviet, whatever, experiment, whatever, in its cradle.
Yeah.
So
why did they do that? Why were they so against the Bolsheviks taking power? We know about the Siberians, right? They were blowing up train tracks, I think, at that time. Is that
you have a number of factors here. First of all, the pre-existing architecture was of these royal families that were all sort of knit across Europe. And this was being taken away from them.
Okay, got it.
All right, that's first. Secondly, you have across the European landscape, let's say particularly in Britain, France, and Germany, which are fair, and the United States, by the way, the most advanced, and in Japan, by the way, the most advanced, and in China too, by the way, the most advanced industrial countries in the world, with well-developed, in most cases, industrial proletariats, okay, who have been engaged, for example, in the United States and Britain and elsewhere, in political struggle for 50 to 100 years already. I mean, Gompers and all those guys here, whatever their deficiencies, there was a working class consciousness, there were working class organizations, and there was a working class that wanted to participate in power. They were all oppressed, and they wanted to be unoppressed. So the last thing you wanted was a model of an uprising in a large landmass in Europe where people take power saying we're the workers and this is going to be a worker state.
Yeah, yeah.
That was a threat to the power structure across the advanced world.
Yeah. Okay.
And they met it immediately.
Yeah.
And so the first order of business for Lenin, for the party and for the people of Russia after the October Revolution, was to secure it. And so they were at war for 2 or 3 or 4 years across this vast land.
Yeah.
Japan coming into Russia, Vladivostok and eastern Siberia, Russia's army decimated pretty much in the war with Germany, pretty much. Way the frig, 7 time zones away, it's 7,000 miles away, without real solid infrastructure. How do you project power to fight Japan? And as you do that, how do you project power in Crimea, where you lost a war in 1905, and in Finland, where they're trying to break off? All of this going on. So they tried to settle everything and turn inward and start to build their industrial base up. And as they did this, Lenin was failing. His personal health was failing. He had the credentials, basically, to bring consensus to policy.
Yeah.
And so as he left from the stage, that there was a hole there. And then there was what people characterize here as a power struggle, quote unquote, between and it's a caricature to put it this way, but between Trotsky and Stalin.
Stalin. Yeah.
Trotsky, remember, his history was really with the Mensheviks, and throughout most of the things I just described, for all his theory about permanent revolution and all that crap, he was counseling, capitulation, basically. We don't have the forces to do this right now. Let's make peace with them on whatever terms we can get. Stalin, having been out in the field and organizing, and again, Trotsky's given credit as a commissar of war for the Red Army, but Stalin was actually like an actual.
He was the William Wallace of the group, right?
Okay.
Yeah,
that's a good way of putting it. Mm-hmm. So after this power struggle is resolved, and the question of what to do with the country is resolved, do we surrender and say, okay, we'll build a bourgeois state? We'll let under Marx's theory and under Lenin's, portrayal of these things, the government, if you're going to have a bourgeois government or a communist government or whatever, these things are a product of the reality on the ground in the economy. How developed are the productive forces? Is it producing housing and food and everything that everybody needs sufficiently? First of all, secondly, what's the distribution of these things? Is it something that everyone's satisfied with? Is it extremely exploitative? Also, what's the legal environment around these things? Is it tolerable? Is it exploitative, etc.? Depending on that stuff, your state's going to reflect it. Okay, so they're saying we don't have the wherewithal to have a workers' government. Our workers don't know how to manage a place. Our workers don't know how to read, okay, etc. Let's let these guys run it and get the best deal we can. That's pretty much, it's a crude way of stating it, but that's pretty much what Trotsky was counseling up until the power struggle.
Got it.
Stalin was counseling something quite different.
Yeah.
He was basically counseling, we got a lot of hands, we got a lot of skills, we got a lot of land and a lot of resources. Let's get the fuck to work and build our state. And that ultimately prevailed. And that ultimately prevailed up until 1939. They started building it.
Yeah. And when people say that you'll hear somebody saying in an organization or a group or an event, well, the problem with the Bolshevik Revolution is that it was Stalinized. That seems like a Trotsky saying that. That's right off.
Moronic.
Yeah, it seems like
first of all, look around the world right now.
Yeah.
The problem with the revolution isn't the problem with the Bolshevik Revolution. The problem with the revolution is that we're not having a revolution now fast enough to stop us from having a third world war. Okay? We're not having a revolution fast enough to stop 9 million people a year from dying of starvation. We're not having a revolution fast enough. I could go on.
Yeah.
People that are arguing over shit that happened 100 years ago as if they know.
Yeah.
Because they don't know. What's the source of your knowledge? I know you're not 100 years old. I can tell. Okay? I know you haven't been studying this for 40 years. You're 26.
Yeah.
etc. How many times have you been to Russia? How many people do you know in the academy there, in the working class institutions there, etc.? What do you know about this from your own experience? And what have you been doing besides talking about Stalin and Lenin and Trotsky in some cafe or university or whatever?
Yeah.
If you can't answer those questions, please shut the fuck up.
Yeah. With their Che Guevara shirt on and Viva la Revolucion and all that BS. Listen, the last question is important. Jamie, I hope you have it ready to put it's number 3 in the doc. When people claim that a lot of the culture war issues, right, the culture issues that exist today in the United States actually came out of either the Bolshevik Revolution or the Mao Revolution What are they referring to, Don? Because I don't get it. And, you know, it's just one of those things. It's like, what are you talking about?
I mean, honestly, beats the hell out of me, but I'm going to take a guess at it because you see all this crap swirling around all the time. Let's start with, first of all, there's I guess the product of, okay. What happened in the Soviet Union happened. I took you up to 1939. We'll leave it at that. The response to the Bolshevik Revolution, the socialist, the workers' revolution in the Soviet Union was first an attempt to kill it and kill as many people carrying it as possible. Then the destruction of as much of the infrastructure as they could achieve to hobble it. And then the unleashing of Hitler and all of that to you know, hobble it further, and then plans to nuclearize them into oblivion, you know, that we now know about, and then the Cold War and everything that happened since. In our culture, in the West, and in the aftermath of the Second World War, American culture became the culture of the West in one fashion or another, with local features. The view of the Soviet Union was that it depending on which audience you were talking to, but it was evil, it was dysfunctional, it was aberrant, it was monstrous in one fashion or another definition, you know, consequently, the thing itself. First, it was called communism. This is communism. Russians never said they had communism. That's a whole different thing. It has nothing to do with, you know, a communist party in power. They were building socialism so someday they could have communism. But what we are told is communism is what was there, and what it meant was there's a police state on top. There's a guy outside your apartment in the next apartment with a, you know, thing up against the wall, taking notes and running a tape recorder. Everything, everyone, everywhere is under surveillance. You have to wait. There's a shortage of everything. Everything's in black and white, by the way. It's in monochrome. You have to wait online, dressed in like, you know, beat up wool clothes and maybe an overcoat in the snow. It snows most of the time too, even in Cuba, I guess. And wait online for shoddy goods that are in short supply. That's communism. So when you hear people here talk about Biden is a communist or the Democrats are communists or socialists, it's within that understanding of what the terms mean.
Yeah.
It's a propagandistic icon that you can see it in Hollywood from the 1920s.
Yeah.
You can see it in print from 1917 forward. And so I have to preface that with this. So, okay. So you have the Chinese Revolution, 1949. China has very complex history, of course. It's very long history, first of all. It's
being conquered. Of being conquered. Yeah.
Not all of it. You know, in any event, there were all kinds of contradictions in there. Anyway, you have a revolution in 1949, and the Communist Party that had been in a revolutionary battle since the 1920s. Okay, finally comes to power, and they're sitting on top of, I forget how many 100 million, 600, 800 million people, a lot of people. A lot of it destroyed. So people do not take into account this fact about China and Russia in particular, that during World War II, most of their industrial capacity, or much of it, was destroyed. Much of the infrastructure, including housing, roads, water supplies, all of that were destroyed. It was conquered by the Japanese in terms of the, most important parts of it, Manchuria, the places closest to Japan, industrial centers. The others ended up servicing the Western military, we flew, for example, the United States flew planes across the India and whatever, and they were bombing Japan from China, from central China. After the revolution, I mean, they inherited, a lot of smoldering mess, a lot of hungry people, and a lot of conflicting ideas on how things should be done.
Yeah.
You have ancient religious trends that, people followed. You have a number of, China is very multi-ethnic, by the way. People here, they're racist. They think of all Asians as being, the same nation or whatever. Not by a long shot. And so the Communist Party, I think they took some lessons from what the Soviets had done in trying to organize a large territory with multiple ethnic and linguistic and all these different, contradictions into people that could know this is what we're going to work on today. Everybody shows up for work. The work gets done. Everybody's pretty happy with that. We try to feed everybody, etc. In the process of doing that, some geniuses, because you have all these academicians that are also end up in the revolution, figured that we would make a new person by designing them. This was also like the new Soviet man or whatever. They'd done that here for many years, and we've got what we've got as human faces. They decided they were going to build the essential error in my mind is this: rather than understanding what Marx understood and almost stated at the beginning, and Hegel, that the mind reflects the world, not the world reflects the mind, they decided they would re-engineer people's thinking, and that would result in a new world. And so they sort of cobbled together like a cultural model and sort of imposed it. Now, I don't think it was done. I don't know. I wasn't there. And I've heard people that lived through this say one and say this one says something entirely contradictory. I know a few people, but the concept of it here was that, you basically became a clone, personality wise, or you had a really hard time. And so there are people here who thought that was a good model and should be, used here too. Generally, the people that like that model, though, are people in power.
Yeah.
They want clones.
Yeah.
They want you to shut up and get back to work. Okay.
So pretty much you're saying that this is something that the Chinese had to do to reconstruct their whole country that was just decimated. And the people today, the truther moment, I would say, whatnot, when they pick apart this Mao revolution. First of all, Shelby, I know if you got to go, you have things to do. Keeping you here so damn long. I should have just done a show itself on a Saturday with Don with this, because, I mean, I know I find this stuff so intriguing, but I'm trying to, the reason why I wanted to do this show with Don and talk about the Bolshevik Revolution is because we need, like you said, we can't have a revolution fast enough to what's going on. The people are split, whatnot. But anytime you hear a lot of people talk about these particular revolutions, whether it be Mao's revolution, whether it be the Bolshevik revolutions, they try to shoot it down. And I think the reason why they try to shoot it down, they try to say it's this cultural thing that Mao was doing, trying to take away people's gender, trying to take away people's religion, just make them clones to work. But they're not looking at the way society was. Don, I know we can talk about this for hours, but it's so late. I have another show to go to too as soon as well. But we can follow up on this another time. I do appreciate you kind of laying it out for us today.
Yeah, I learned a lot.
Yeah, I mean, this is just the tip of the iceberg. And like, even though it was like an hour, I'm like listening to every single word. I had a conversation for 40 minutes with Don about this the other day. Yeah. I don't want us to have a chance for a revolution thwarted, right? Messed with by when people look for an example for the Bolsheviks, which was a genuine workers' revolution. You had signs where they said, give us bread, give us land, give us peace. And they all walked together and they took the fucking capital, right? Because they realized that class-wise, they're all on that same level. So I wanted Don to explain some of that stuff, because I do have a lot of Truther friends, and they're like, the Bolshevik Revolution was sponsored by Arm& Hammer, or it was sponsored by some elite groups. It was the Rothschilds that were behind it and whatnot. So that makes you think that, wait a second, that a revolution from the workers is never possible. That's why I wanted to have this conversation today.
I just want to say something that, the intro for your show, the one that should have played, is really,
Jamie, you hear that?
Makes the I'm just busting Jamie's stuff. Makes the point, and generally you make this point, that the real struggle is against imperialism. And by the way, Lenin makes that point quite well about 100 years ago. No matter what any of these revolutions are or were or became, because those are all terms you have to look at, looking at anything that happened, any sociological phenomenon, any historical event. You have to look at what it was, what it became, and things that flowed from that. If you were to forget all of that crap and look right now at the great evil being imperialism and just take that down, whatever we do next will be under much more favorable conditions for all of us.
Yeah.
And then we can fight over that stuff.
Yeah.
The thing we have to deal with right now is where power rests.
Yeah.
And power rests in the empire. And we have a whole changing world in front of us with the rise of multipolarity and all of this that provides opportunities to check this beast that's managed to assemble itself and that threatens the survival of our species. Yeah. And I think that's the ball we got to keep our eye on.
Absolutely, Don Debar. Thank you so much. We'll have you on again soon. Thank you, Paisan. I'll see you soon. You want to say anything? Anything going on?
I'm going to go upstairs and eat dinner.
Say hi to Sammy.
And Margot.
And Margot. I haven't met her yet, so I can't say anything. So I said hello, and I'm looking forward to meeting her.
And thank you. It was very nice meeting you, too.
It was great to meet you. Have an awesome night.
Thank you, too. Peace, guys.